Essay on the Return of the King by Douglas Wilson from Omnibus 2 by Veritas Press. The Return of the King. When you were little, did you ever plant seeds in an egg carton? The first time you did this, it was perhaps all that your mother or your kindergarten teacher could do to keep you from digging them up every day to see how they were doing. Even the smallest child knows that a seed is supposed to turn into something else entirely. The problem that small children have with the process is not the transformation, but with the idea of gradual transformation. Because of impatience, a small child does not want to wait for gradual transformations. But in fact, God created the world in such a way that gradual transformations are so commonplace that we often don't see them or recognize them. Sudden transformations catch our eye, and we call them miracles. When Jesus made wine out of water in the miracle at Cana, he did it suddenly, and the people who saw him do it noticed what happened because it was so unusual. But God changes water into wine all the time. All the wine in the world used to be water, but because the transformation is slow and involves water falling out of the sky, soaking into the dirt, getting sucked into roots, being shaped into tasty globules called grapes, being picked off the vine, smashed into a glorious paste, and eventually bottled, we call it the work of nature. Why a photograph of a homely hobbit hole while our heroes are struggling in the dark war of the Ring? The Shire, with its green hills, clean rivers, and lovely woodlands, whose inhabitants indulge in its unspoiled pleasures, represents all that is good in Middle-earth. It is this goodness that is the true heart of the cause in the fight against the evil of Mordor. One of the marks of a person who is educated to think like a Christian is the fact that he or she has learned to notice these gradual transformations. He does not take them for granted, nor does he see them and mistakenly attribute them to some kind of impersonal, natural law. Our task, as we finish reading The Lord of the Rings, is to see how J.R.R. Tolkien reflected this Christian wisdom so ably, because The Return of the King is all about gradual transformations, which are no less complete for all that when they are done. General information. Main characters. The Return of the King continues with the characters we've been introduced to in the earlier books, with just a few important developments. We still have Frodo and Sam on the way to Mount Doom. Perry, Merry, and Pippin are still with us, as are Aragorn, Gimli, Legolas, and Gandalf. Gollum assumes a much more important role in this last book. The most important new character is Denethor, the father of Boromir and Faramir. He is a steward of Gondor and has been a noble adversary of the growing power of Sauron, but unfortunately, he has a weakness that Sauron is able to exploit successfully. We also come to know Éowyn far better than we did before this book. As the tale concludes, she comes to the point of noble despair and is restored in a very interesting way. Summary and setting. The culminating book of The Lord of the Rings is set in Middle-earth, as are the others. In this last book, the great armies of Middle-earth form up for their great confrontation. Gondor is under siege, and the riders of Rohan go to their aid. Aragorn goes to their aid by a different route, through the paths of the dead. Sauron, the evil threat to all that is good, has mustered his forces and is on the march. And while these armies are marching and fighting, the final outcome of all things depends on the two hobbits making their way to Mount Doom, where the Ring of Power was first forged, and which is the only place it can be destroyed. As they come to that place, how J.R.R. Tolkien managed to write such a satisfying surprise in such a predictable place is one of the great achievements of his book. Worldview. Throughout these books, we have noted a recurring pattern. The wicked seize after power. They grasp after it, while the righteous are willing to deny themselves and relinquish power. Let it go. This is not only the divide between righteousness and unrighteousness. It is also the division between magic and black technology on the one hand, and craftsmanship and art on the other. And so we have seen that all the wicked characters in these books lust after the ring, and all the righteous are those who want to see it destroyed. And so it looks as though the unrighteous will win because they're willing to grab what they want, and the righteous will throw away a perfectly good opportunity to destroy the bad guys because they decide to destroy the ring. But to use a truth you might have learned from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, there is always a deeper magic. The Bible teaches that those who humble themselves will be exalted, from James 4. The one who wants to become great must become the servant of all, from Mark chapter 9. Jesus Christ went to the cross, which really was a shameful death, and he did it for the joy that was set before him, from Hebrews 12. And this is the deeper magic. Death is followed by resurrection. This is God's consistent pattern for victory. The advance of God's kingdom is a series of triumphs that were cleverly disguised as disasters. Middle-earth may seem like a very different world, but because this pattern is seen and honored, we can tell that fundamentally it is the same world. It is God's world. J.R.R. Tolkien had a word to describe an aspect of this pattern, and that word was eucatastrophe. The word catastrophe indicates the intensity of the kind of ending he had in mind, but the prefix "eu" means good or blessed. In a sense, the resurrection of Jesus after he had been dead for 3 days was a eucatastrophe. Learning that your teacher changed your grade from 92 to a 94 is not a eucatastrophe. In Middle-earth, just when everything seems absolutely hopeless, and the good guys go on doing their duty simply because it is their duty, at that moment, everything turns right. Gandalf, I thought you were dead. But then I thought I was dead myself. Is everything sad going to come untrue? What's happened to the world? A great shadow has departed, said Gandalf. But there is another important aspect of this. It is not as though the righteous are threatened, and then at the last moment deliverance comes, and so everybody goes back to exactly the place where they were before. No, the long and slow process of coming to the point where everything seems hopeless, followed by this eucatastrophic, and climactic deliverance, is a process that completely transforms the characters who go through it. When Jesus comes back from the dead, he is recognizably the same person, Jesus of Nazareth, but at the same time he is also transformed by his conquest of death. He is the Lord of glory. In Christian stories, this element of continuity and transformation is reflected in the characters. And so is the kind of thing, in varying degrees, this is the kind of thing, in varying degrees, that happens to virtually every major character in The Lord of the Rings. J.R.R. Tolkien guides us slowly and imperceptibly to this place. For example, look at how Aragorn speaks when we first meet him in Bree. Well, says Strider, with Sam's permission we will call that settled. Strider shall be your guide. Compare this with his kingly speech in the last book. Between us there can be no word of giving or taking or reward, for we are brethren. In happy hour did Eor roll from the north, and never has a league of peoples been more blessed, so that neither has ever failed the other. Early in the story, Strider's appearance and speech is homely. By the end of the books, his bearing, demeanor, and speech are overwhelmingly kingly. Aragorn does not just become the king, he is transformed in the course of the story, and he becomes king. Consider who is transformed in the course of these books, and the death that each undergoes in the course of this transformation. Like his son Boromir, this is something that Denethor does not understand. For him, death is the end. But because he does not understand the great death and resurrection pattern, he sees by his art the deliverance of his own city, and yet does not recognize it. Thinking that he has greater wisdom than Gandalf, he misses the deepest wisdom of all. And now even the wind of thy hope cheats thee and wafts up Anduin, a fleet with black sails. The west has failed. It is time for all to depart who would not be slaves. Gandalf says later that although Denethor was too great to be subdued to the will of the dark power, he saw nonetheless only those things which that power permitted him to see. And the thing he missed was the great theme of transformation. Those who are transformed include Gandalf the Grey, who becomes Gandalf the White after his death in Moria. Aragorn is transformed from a solitary ranger into a great king after his death of riding through the paths of the dead. Frodo is transformed to such an extent that he cannot settle again in the Shire. Sam can live contentedly in the Shire, but he has been transformed in a different way. Both Frodo and Sam were brought back from the brink of death at Mount Doom. Merry and Pippin are not as transformed, but the changes are still marked. And they are changes that come from life after death. In all this, sacrifices are made on behalf of others. As Frodo put it, "It must often be so, Sam, when things are in danger. Someone has to give them up, lose them, so that others may keep them." But on the other side of sacrifice is great joy, joy that cannot be touched by any of the troubles of Middle-earth. Sam has this realization when he looks up at the sky in Mordor and he sees a star. For like a shaft, clear and cold, the thought pierced him that in the end the shadow was only a small and passing thing. There was light and high beauty forever beyond its reach. Ultimate goodness is out of evil's reach. But then, in another sense, in Christian stories, goodness comes down to where evil can reach it. Death, therefore, comes to do its work, and in that work, death is tricked. Goodness is transformed into a higher and deeper good. And this is something that those who traffic in magic can never understand, until it is too late. And far away, as Frodo put on the ring and claimed it for his own, even in Sammath Naur, the very heart of his realm, the power in Barad-dûr was shaken, and the tower trembled from its foundations to its proud and bitter crown. The Dark Lord was suddenly aware of him, and his eye, piercing all shadows, looked across the plain to the door that he had made, and the magnitude of his own folly was revealed to him in a blinding flash, and all the devices of his enemies were at last laid bare. Then his wrath blazed in consuming flame, but his fear rose like a vast black smoke to choke him, for he knew his deadly peril and the dread, and the thread upon his doom, and the thread upon which his doom now hung. Frodo succumbs to the power of the ring at the very last moment, and he does this for several reasons. The first is seen in the quotation above. It is a dramatic reason. Tolkien does not want Sauron to be absolutely blindsided. He wants Sauron to have some notion that he might be defeated before he actually is. It's necessary to have Sauron know before he falls that he's in danger. Tolkien did something similar when he tells us earlier that Aragorn had revealed himself to Sauron through the Palantir. Yes, Master Gimli, he saw me, but in another guise than you see me here. If that will aid him, then I have done ill. But I do not think so. To know that I lived and walked the earth was a blow to his heart, I deem, for he knew it not till now. The other reason that Frodo fails at the very end is to show that evil is resisted by mortals and not by superhumans. I have come, he said, but I do not choose now to do what I came to do. I will not do this deed. The ring is mine. And suddenly, as he set it on his finger, he vanished from Sam's sight. Frodo fails, but then, when he does, the mercy he had earlier shown to Gollum comes back to deliver him. And even Sam, who had resisted Frodo's earlier kindness to Gollum, had eventually shown that same mercy to Gollum himself. And this mercy was used at the end to make a decision for Frodo that he was no longer strong enough to make himself do the thing. Yes, said Frodo, but do you remember Gandalf's words? Even Gollum may have something yet to do. But for him, Sam, I could not have destroyed the ring. The quest would have been in vain, even at the bitter end. So let us forgive him. There are a few other important elements to consider in this book. One of them is the fact that it is possible to enter into conflict and war with a clean conscience. And then all the host of Rohan burst into song, and they sang as they slew, for the joy of battle was on them, and the sound of their singing that was fair and terrible came even to the city. A few pages later, Éomer shows the same exhilaration of battle when he mistakenly thinks that Aragorn's ships belong to the enemy. These staves he spoke, yet he laughed as he said them. For once more lust of battle was on him, and he was still unscathed, and he was young, and he was king, the lord of a fell people. And lo, even as he laughed at despair, he looked out again on the black ships, and he lifted up his sword to defy them. As Christians, we know that we are not to be bloodthirsty for the sake of entertainment. But although this sentiment of Éomer's was not something we're used to, it would have been recognized by the warrior psalmist of Israel. One last lesson of this great book needs to be emphasized. After all the great battles have been fought, the great deeds done, the great legends established, and the great songs composed, Tolkien has the halflings return to the Shire. And there in the Shire they discover that the wickedness they had been fighting has come to their home in a petty and vindictive form. The lesson here is that it's not enough to fight the great evils. The applications of the noblest battles are worthless unless we are courageous enough to extend them. The scouring of the Shire is a deeply satisfying conclusion to The Lord of the Rings for several reasons. The first is that the idea of a homecoming in which everything is put right is a formula that people have loved since Homer wrote the Odyssey. But secondly, the great battle has been fought. Now the task is to apply the fruits of that victory. We as Christians know that Jesus has defeated Satan in his death and resurrection. Our task is to apply that victory where we live and put the Shire to rights. Gandalf says this to the hobbits: I'm not coming to the Shire. You must settle its affairs yourselves. That is what you've been trained for. It's very interesting to note the form in which evil comes to the Shire. For Tolkien, hobbits represent the ordinary working folk. His picture of evil they must confront is very interesting indeed. He shows us evil in the form of petty bureaucracy and rule-making. The hobbits don't come back to the Shire to find a mayor with red eyes, dressed in ominous black, and lightning bolts coming from his fingertips. Star Wars. They come back to find petty oppression and rules. As Hobb put it, it's all these gatherers and sharers, I reckon, going round counting and measuring and taking off to storage. They do more gathering than sharing, and we never see most of that stuff again. It's important to note that Tolkien represents the returning hobbits as free, and not as scofflaws. The returning hobbits know what true law is. They know what freedom is. And Tolkien makes it as plain as anything that we need to learn what they knew. As Sam said to the gatekeeper, if hobbits of the Shire are to be kept out in the wet on a night like this, I'll tear down your notice when I find it. When they find a place to sleep, they find other things as well. In the upper rooms were little rows of hard beds. On every wall there was a notice and a list of rules. Pippin tore them down. All right, said Sam. That's quite enough. I don't want to hear no more. No welcome, no beer, no smoke, and a lot of rules and orc talk instead. When they return home, the hobbits discover that the War of the Ring is not over for them. Gandalf says, "You are grown up now, grown indeed very high. Now the hobbits have grown up enough to know why and how to battle against evil." Okay, Sam says, "If I hear not aloud much oftener," said Sam, "I'm going to get angry." Genuine evil has come to the Shire, and real damage is done. And just as it was resisted in Mordor and before the gates of Minas Tirith, and in the siege of Orthanc, and the desperate battle at Helm's Deep, so must it be resisted in the Shire. Saruman has come to the Shire in order to maliciously strike back at the hobbits, and so he must be resisted there as well. But this resistance is closer to home, and it shows at the last what all the fighting is over. The point of freedom is not so that the word freedom can float over our heads and light up the sky. The point of freedom is to enjoy a pint of beer and a pipe, to tend the garden, to read stories to your little ones, including this one, and to enjoy your supper. At least, this is how Samwise Gamgee sees it. And he went on, and there was yellow light and fire within, and the evening meal was ready, and he was expected. And Rose drew him in, and set him in his chair, and put little Elinor on his lap. He drew a deep breath. "Well, I'm back," he said. Essay by Douglas Wilson.